Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
Last night, a night that was supposed to be fun and carefree, turned into something far more sinister. It all started like any other night after work. My friends, my crush and I had decided to meet up at my favorite bar for some drinks and laughter. I was lucky enough to leave work 30 minutes early, so I arrived first. I walked into the bar, the familiar scent of wood and alcohol filling the air. The place was dimly lit, with soft music playing in the background. I ordered a beer, feeling a slight sense of anticipation. As I glanced around, I noticed him. A huge, muscular guy with a long ponytail sitting alone at the bar. He had a bottle of vodka in front of him, and the seat next to him was empty. Without hesitation, he turned to me and offered a seat. "Come on, sit here," he said, his voice rough but friendly. I hesitated for a second, unsure, but I took the seat anyway. We made some small talk. He asked why I was alone and commented on how uneasy and nervous I looked. His words felt strange, but nothing about the night seemed out of place at that moment. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was the dim lighting, but I felt oddly drawn to the conversation. He kept talking, telling me to relax, that everything would be fine. He mentioned his vodka bottle again, and I didn't think too much of it. After all, he was just another guy in the bar, right? Then my friends showed up just as I finished my first beer. We all moved to a table together, and the atmosphere lightened as we drank, laughed, and had a great time. But whenever I went to the bathroom, there he was, that same man from the bar. He would ask me if I was okay, his eyes filled with something unsettling. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the alcohol and my own overactive imagination. But then things started to shift. As the night wore on, I began to feel a strange sense of sickness creeping over me. My stomach turned, and I felt dizzy. I stepped outside for a cigarette, hoping the cold air would help clear my head. That's when he followed me. He appeared out of nowhere, standing just a few feet away, his eyes fixed on me like a predator. "You okay?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. That's when the unease set in. The bar was packed, but it felt like his eyes were always on me. Every time I moved, he was there, watching, waiting. I went back inside, ordered a glass of water, and told my friends I wasn't feeling well. I needed to leave. They offered to take me home, and in my state, I was more than grateful for the offer. But as I took a sip of water, everything hit me like a freight train. My vision blurred, my head spun, and before I knew it, I was running outside, barely able to stand, and throwing up in the alleyway. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see. I just wanted it to stop. My friends rushed to me, but I couldn't seem to get my bearings. I could hear them arguing about whether to call a taxi or drag me home, but I wasn't sure I cared at that point. Then, like a ghost emerging from the shadows, he appeared, the man from the bar. He stood there, almost too calmly, and said, "I live just down the street. You can sleep on my couch, it's okay." His voice was smooth, coaxing, like a venomous whisper in the night. My co-worker, who had always been like an older brother to me, stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. "Get the hell away from her," he shouted, his voice a protective growl. The man backed off, but not before throwing one last look in my direction, one that sent a chill down my spine. My friends helped me stand, though it felt like every muscle in my body was frozen. They managed to drag me to my friend's place, where I collapsed on the couch, clutching a bucket, praying that the world would stop spinning. The next morning I woke up, my body feeling like it had been hit by a truck. I couldn't stand. I couldn't move without my stomach turning. It was a few hours before I could finally stumble to the train station, my head still foggy, my body trembling. I felt like I was in a dream, unable to fully wake up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something had been off about that man, something dark and twisted, I pray to God I never see him again, that he never does this to anyone else. But deep down, I know something worse might be lurking out there, waiting to strike again. I just hope the nightmare is over. But I'll never forget his eyes, the way they followed me all night, the way he seemed to enjoy my fear. I don't know what he was capable of, but I thank my lucky stars that my friends were there to protect me. But I'll never look at that bar the same way again. And I'll never forget the strange man with the dark eyes, whose presence still haunts me in the quiet moments, when I'm alone and the shadows seem to creep a little too close. It was a Saturday night, and I was looking forward to unwinding with my girlfriend. After a week of being caught up in the grind, we decided to head to our favorite bar for some much-needed time together. We got there around 10 p.m., and the place was bustling, a perfect mix of chatter and laughter, with neon lights casting an eerie glow across the room. We found a table, settled in, and I went up to grab us some drinks. As I returned, drink in hand, I noticed a figure in my seat, talking to my girlfriend. I set the drinks down, and before I could ask what was going on, the guy turned to me. He had a confident smile, but something about it seemed off. "I was just asking if she wanted to get a drink with me," he said casually. My stomach twisted. I waited for her to answer, but she quickly chimed in. "I'm here with him," she said, gesturing to me. The guy looked over at me, then shrugged with an air of indifference. "All right, see you later then," he muttered, and walked off. We tried to shake it off, but the unease lingered in the air like a cloud. The conversation shifted, and we tried to get back to our night, but I couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. About 20 minutes later, she excused herself to use the restroom. I stayed at the table, keeping an eye on our drinks. When she came back, I noticed that same guy walking beside her, talking to her again. My heart sank. She gave me a quick glance, but it was clear she didn't want him around. I stood up and asked him, "What do you think you're doing?" Without hesitation, he replied, "Trying to buy her a drink. I was done. Leave us alone or I'll tell the bartender you're creeping out customers." He looked me up and down, scoffed, and told me to buzz off before he walked back to the bar. My mind was racing as I sat down next to my girlfriend, and we decided it was time to leave. We paid our tab and waited for our Uber, but that's when things started to take a dark turn. Without warning, she spun around, her face pale. The same guy was standing behind us, a twisted grin on his face. She didn't seem to realize it at first, but then he said something that made her stomach churn. "You shouldn't go home with strange men when you're drunk, you know. I could call you a cab, get you home safe," he suggested, his voice sickly sweet. I stepped between them, my hands trembling with anger. "Leave, now," I said, my voice low and menacing. He gave me another spiteful look, and with a final mocking goodnight, he turned and disappeared into the night. The next day my phone buzzed. It was a message from her, and the words made my blood run cold. That same creepy guy had found her on Facebook. He had sent her a message asking if she made it home okay, and, creepily, asked how serious she was about us. She was furious and told him to off and leave her alone or she'd call the cops. But then he sent the most chilling message of all. "You fit all of my preferences. I've never seen a more beautiful woman." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I told her to block him immediately and asked for his name. When she sent me the details, I checked out his profile. My heart dropped as I saw that he was in the same school as us, studying in a similar major, and had even made friends with someone I knew. How had he found out who she was? The more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't add up. He must have figured it out at the bar. We had been at a student-friendly spot, and with all the familiarity and connections there, it was easy to assume he'd somehow pieced it together. I had enough. I asked her for screenshots of the messages and immediately reported it to campus security, telling them the whole story. We both blocked him and hoped we wouldn't ever see his face again. But a chill settled in my chest because some things don't just vanish. The way he watched us, the way he'd found her. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again. We knew he was out there, lurking in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment to strike. And that's when I realized some people can't just be shaken off. Some people follow you into the darkness, waiting to make their move. It was about 15 years ago when I was just 22, and my girlfriend and I were regulars at the local bars, going out 3 or 4 times a week to unwind and meet people. Among the many bars we frequented, there was one that stood out. A dimly lit place with a reputation for its eccentric staff and festive atmosphere. This was the week of Halloween, and the staff was dressed in different costumes each night. That's where we first met Ron. I didn't give him much thought at the time, just another bouncer at the door, no different from the others. I handed him my ID, barely noticing him as I walked past, but there was something about him, something I couldn't put my finger on, that lingered in the back of my mind. I wasn't one to make eye contact with anyone. I had trouble looking people directly in the face. But later my girlfriend's friend, the bartender, brought him up. "Hey, what do you think of Ron?" she asked, giving a sly smile. "You mean the bouncer?" I replied, confused. "Yeah, the one with all the skulls on his clothes and that heavy presence." At 22, I wasn't one to waste time on people who didn't immediately fit my vibe. Ron was a bit older than me, built like a tank, a gym rat with muscles that seemed to have grown from some deep, unnatural place. He wore black and had skulls stitched into every piece of clothing, platforms on his boots, looking like he belonged more in a metal band than behind a bouncer's desk. But then my bartender friend vouched for him, saying he was a decent guy. Cool, laid back. So when she suggested I give him my number, I didn't think much of it. The next day I got a message from Ron. He wanted to hang out. We'd just met, but I was always up for a casual chill day, so I agreed. We met at his apartment, which had an eerie feel about it. The door was wide open, and his friend, someone much closer to my age, was there. They seemed nice enough, but something about the place felt off. Like it was too open, too exposed. Ron mentioned that he had to run out to grab some office supplies, so we all piled into his flashy muscle car and headed to a store. I tried not to notice how he openly stared at a pretty girl walking by, eyes locked on her like a predator. It wasn't just a quick glance. It was an uncomfortable, lingering gaze that made my stomach turn. I wasn't his girlfriend, but I was his guest, and it felt disrespectful. I mentioned it later, asking him to be less obvious, but he only laughed. "It's hot that you stood up for yourself, especially on our first hangout," he chuckled, brushing it off. When we got back to his place, he said something that made my spine stiffen, but I laughed it off. "You'll have a ring on your finger by December." It wasn't just a strange thing to say. It was like he already saw our futures together, and that didn't sit well with me. As we drank and talked, I learned more about him, where he was from, his time as a Desert Storm veteran, his life as a full-time student while working as a bouncer at night. But the more we talked, the more I felt like there was a dark side to him that he wasn't showing. A week later, I brought him my encyclopedia of serial killers, thinking he'd appreciate it since he mentioned a passing interest in the topic. The next time we hung out, we drank heavily, and that's when he started crossing lines. He said something to me that felt wrong, like he was testing my boundaries. I turned to walk away, but before I could, he grabbed my hair at the base of my neck. The sharp tug made my heart race. It wasn't playful, it wasn't joking, it felt predatory. I snapped around, grabbed his hand, and told him not to ever touch me like that again. He laughed it off, trying to act like it was just some twisted foreplay. But I wasn't amused. I wanted to leave, but I was too drunk to drive, so I stayed, forcing myself to breathe slowly, hoping the alcohol would wear off. He tried to brush it off, but then, without warning, he began telling me about his favorite serial killer from the book I'd lent him. It was disturbing, the way he described it, like he was speaking from experience. And then came the kicker. As we sat there, he casually mentioned he had a machete under his mattress. His eyes glinted with something I couldn't understand. I looked down and saw the handle of the machete barely sticking out. My heart pounded in my chest as he told me, in a chilling, calm voice, that he could make me disappear, and no one would ever find my body. That was it. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my bag, ran to my car, and didn't look back. He lumbered behind me, laughing, his footsteps echoing in the parking lot. But I didn't stop. I didn't care what he said. My adrenaline was pumping so fast that it felt like my heart would burst. Once I was in my car, I drove aimlessly, not knowing where to go, just trying to calm down. I pulled into a parking lot near the mall and sat there, breathing deeply, calling my girlfriend to tell her everything. For the next week, my phone didn't stop buzzing with messages and calls from Ron. He alternated between begging me for another chance and insulting me, calling me a poser. I warned my bartender friend, and he couldn't believe it. He said Ron was trouble, but he didn't get involved. Ron moved on, setting his sights on a new girl, a young woman in her early 20s whose family owned a local restaurant. Ron got her pregnant almost immediately, and I couldn't help but wonder what happened to her. Did she end up stuck with him? Now, every time I find myself near that area, my stomach twists in fear. I hope I never see Ron again. I pray he hasn't learned anything from the encyclopedia I gave him. I don't even want to think about what might happen next. It was a chilly autumn night, the kind where the air bites at your skin and the shadows seem to stretch farther than they should. Claire, a 26-year-old bartender with long dark hair and a natural charm, was wrapping up a busy Friday shift. It had been one of those nights where the crowd was relentless, and supplies had dwindled faster than usual. Her manager asked her to make a quick run to a 24-hour grocery store just a few miles down the road. Claire hesitated, but finally agreed. She grabbed her coat, keys, and a sense of unease she couldn't quite shake off. The fluorescent lights of the grocery store flickered as she entered, casting unnatural shadows across the aisles. The place was nearly deserted, save for the occasional night owl shuffling about. Claire moved quickly, grabbing lemons, limes, and the other essentials. She felt the familiar weight of her pocket knife tucked into her jacket, a small reassurance in an otherwise eerie setting. As she turned into the liquor aisle, her heart sank. Two men, rugged and disheveled, stood near the shelves. They were in their late 30s with bloodshot eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. The taller one, lean and muscular, had a predatory grin. The shorter one, stocky and slightly hunched, had a sneer that made her skin crawl. They whispered to each other, their eyes never leaving her. Claire tried to keep her composure, grabbing what she needed and heading toward the self-checkout. She could feel their stares burning into her back, the air heavy with an unspoken threat. As she scanned her items, the men appeared beside her, choosing the station right next to hers. "Stocking up for a party?" the taller one asked, his voice dripping with an unsettling mix of mockery and menace. Claire gave a curt, polite smile. "Not really, just some things for work." But they weren't satisfied. The taller man leaned closer, invading her personal space. "You should come hang out with us, we'll show you a good time." Her stomach twisted. She muttered a quick, "No thanks," but he didn't back off. His tone darkened. "Oh, I see. You're one of those types, aren't you? Too good for guys like us." The shorter man chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down her spine. "Maybe she needs to be taught a lesson," he murmured. Claire's pulse raced. She kept her eyes on the scanner, her hands trembling slightly as she reached into her purse. Sliding her pocket knife into her sleeve, she positioned herself defensively, her body shielding the motion from the men. She glanced toward the self-checkout worker, a tall woman with an imposing presence. and gave her a wide-eyed look that silently screamed, "Help me." The machine suddenly beeped in error, its shrill tone cutting through the tension. The worker quickly approached, her sharp eyes assessing the situation. The men immediately changed their demeanor, plastering fake smiles on their faces. "Having trouble there?" the worker asked, her voice steady but laced with suspicion. "Yeah, she's probably trying to steal something," the taller man joked, his tone failing to mask his hostility. The worker wasn't buying it. She canceled Claire's transaction with a few quick taps and said, "Let me ring you up at a register. This machine's acting up." She placed a firm hand on Claire's shoulder, guiding her toward the front of the store. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice low enough for only Claire to hear. As they approached the register near the security office, Claire could see the men lingering near the exit. Their eyes followed her every move, their sinister intent unmistakable. The worker scanned her items with deliberate slowness, keeping an eye on the men. "I already called security," the worker murmured. "They'll walk you out. Don't worry, you're not alone in this." Claire nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. The store was eerily silent, save for the distant hum of the freezers. When the worker finished, she motioned for the security guard, a broad-shouldered man who looked like he could handle himself in a fight. Together, they escorted Claire to the parking lot. The air was freezing, the lot almost empty except for a single truck parked in the back. Its engine idled, headlights glaring like predatory eyes. Claire's breath hitched. The truck didn't belong there. Its position gave the occupants a perfect view of the store's exit. The men were waiting, their silhouettes barely visible through the windshield. The worker and the guard exchanged a look before turning to Claire. "Get in your car, but don't leave yet," the guard said firmly. "We're going to watch them." Claire unlocked her car, her fingers trembling. She slid into the driver's seat but didn't start the engine. The truck's lights flashed as it revved its engine. For a moment it felt like a standoff, a tense, silent battle of wills. Finally, the truck roared to life, peeling out of the lot with a screech of tires. The sound echoed into the night, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Claire exhaled shakily, the tension in her body slowly unraveling. The worker leaned into her window. "They're gone now, but don't let your guard down. Get home safe." Claire nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, both of you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." As she drove away, the night felt darker than before, the shadows deeper. The experience left her shaken, a lingering sense of dread following her home. Even now, years later, she avoids being alone in unfamiliar places after dark. The memory of that night serves as a chilling reminder sometimes the monsters aren't in the shadows. They're standing right beside you,